Okay, we are now recording. Okay, I'm going to share screen. And let me click the link. Okay. Okay, I'm going to show, come on, pause. Why is, okay, here we go. A little bit of a lag time. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to share okay, let me there we go. There is the browser. Okay. I'm going to share a video of a TED Talk given by Kanwan Ryu called I'm Not Your Asian American Stereotype. It's not long. It's about less than 10 minutes. We're going to listen in on this, and we're going to talk about the model minority myth, its problems, and why the occasion of which is actually devastating for the Asian American community, anti-Asian violence. If there is any good that can be drawn from the violence that are done by Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans, and the division it threatens, because it's particularly pointed to mostly Chinese Americans because of what happened with COVID-20 and the unfortunate designation that our past president called it as the Chinese flu and whatever horrendous labels that put on it. It has created a surge of violence, especially against the Chinese American community, that has been divisive. And I'll tell a story about how that's been divisive among other Asian Americans, because I think what should happen is a unity, and I think that certain segments in that it's happening, but this has actually been used, and this is a strategy of racism. I'm not going to pinpoint it to any human authors, but the structures of racism often is that it pits one ethnic group against another. It divides rather than unites. And so it's not just about division between whites and other people of color on the black-white spectrum, but it's also about dividing those who are non-whites against one another. That's the power of racism. So we're going to talk about that in a bit, but I want you to just listen to this short clip about some of the Asian stereotypes that people live with. And so I'm going to let Candace Wu talk about that in the next 10 minutes. So let me do this. Okay, hold on. When I share screen, I want to make sure, share sound. There we go. All right. And then I want to make sure the sound is up. Hopefully it won't be too loud. I'll put the volume loud. You reduce it on your computers if it's too loud, okay? That way it's not going to be too quiet. I'm going to share that. Okay, can everyone see this full screen?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm going to play.
My name is Kanwan, and I play both the piano and the violin. I aspire to someday be a doctor, and my favorite subject is calculus. My mom and dad are tiger parents who won't let me go to sleepovers, but they make up for it by serving my favorite meal every single day: rice. And I'm a really bad driver. So my question for you now is, how long did it take you to figure out I was joking? As you've probably guessed, today I'm going to talk about race, and I'll start off by sharing with you my story of growing up Asian American. I moved to the United States when I was 2 years old, so almost my entire life has been a blend of two cultures. I eat pasta with chopsticks, am addicted to orange chicken, and my childhood hero was Yao Ming. But having grown up in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Idaho, all states with incredibly little racial diversity, it was difficult to reconcile my so-called exotic Chinese heritage with my mainstream American self. Used to being the only Asian in the room, I was self-conscious that the first thing people noticed about me was that I wasn't white. And as a child, I quickly began to realize that I had two options in front of me: conform to the stereotype that was expected of me, or conform to the whiteness that surrounded me. There was no in between. For me, this meant that I always felt self-conscious about being good at math because people would just say it was because I was Asian and not because I actually worked hard. It meant that whenever a boy asked me out, it was because he had the yellow fever and not because he actually liked me. It meant that for the longest time, my identity had formed around the fact that I was different, and I thought that being Asian was the only special thing about me. These effects were emphasized by the places where I lived. Don't get me wrong, only a small percentage of people were actually racist or even borderline racist, but the vast majority were just a little bit clueless. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what's the difference? Well, here's an example. Not racist can sound like I'm white and you're not. Racist can sound like I'm white, you're not, and that makes me better than you. But clueless sounds like I'm white, you're not, and I don't know how to deal with that. Now, I don't doubt for a second that these clueless people are still nice individuals with great intentions, but they do ask some questions that become pretty annoying after a while. Here are a few examples. You're Chinese? Oh my goodness, I have a Chinese friend. Do you know him? No, I don't know him. Because contrary to your unrealistic expectations, I do not know every single one of the 1.35 billion Chinese people who live on planet Earth. People also tend to ask, where does your name come from? And I really don't know how to answer that, so I usually just stick with the truth. My parents gave it to me. Where does your name come from? Don't even get me started on how many times people have confused me with a different Asian person. One time, someone came up to me and said, "Angie, I love your artwork," and I was super confused, so I just thanked them and walked away. But out of all of the questions, my favorite one is still the classic, "Where are you from?" Because I've lived in quite a few places, so this is how the conversation usually goes. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Boise, Idaho. I see, but where are you really from? I lived in South Dakota for a while. Okay, what about before that? I lived in North Dakota. Okay, I'm just gonna cut straight to the chase here. I guess what I'm saying is, have you ever lived anywhere far away from here where people talk a little differently? Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yes, I have. I used to live in Texas. By then, they usually have just given up and wonder to themselves why I'm not one of the cool Asians like Jeremy Lin or Jackie Chan, or they skip the needless banter and go straight for the "where is your family from?" So just an FYI for all of you out there, that is the safest strategy. But as amusing as these interactions were, oftentimes they made me want to reject my own culture because I thought it helped me conform. I distanced myself from the Asian stereotype as much as possible by degrading my own race and pretending I hated math. And the worst part was, it worked. The more I rejected my Chinese identity, the more popular I became. My peers liked me more because I was more similar to them. I became more confident because I knew I was more similar to them. But as I became more and more Americanized, I also began to lose bits and pieces of myself, parts of me that I could never get back. And no matter how much I tried to pretend that I was the same as my American classmates, I wasn't. Because for people who have lived in the places where I lived, white is the norm, and for me, white became the norm too. For my 14th birthday, I received the video game Sims 3, which lets you create your own characters and control their lives. My 14-year-old self created the perfect little mainstream family, complete with a huge mansion and enormous swimming pool. I binge played the game for about 3 months and put it away and never really thought about it again until a few weeks ago when I came to a sudden realization. The family that I had custom designed was white. The character that I had designed for myself was white. Everyone I had designed was white. And the worst part was, this was by no means a conscious decision that I had made. Never once did I think to myself that I could actually make the characters look like me. Without even thinking, white had become my norm too. The truth is, Asian Americans play a strange role in the American melting pot. We are the model minority. Society uses our success to pit us against other people of color as justification that racism doesn't exist. But what does that mean for us Asian Americans? It means that we aren't quite similar enough to be accepted, but we aren't different enough to be loathed. We are in a perpetually gray zone, and society isn't quite sure what to do with us. So they group us by the color of our skin. They tell us that we must reject our own heritages so we can fit in with the crowd. They tell us that our foreignness is the only identifying characteristic of us. They strip away our identities one by one until we are foreign but not quite foreign, American but not quite American, individual, but only when there are no other people from our native country around. I wish that I had always had the courage to speak out about these issues. But coming from one culture that avoids confrontation and another that is divided over race, how do I overcome the pressure to keep the peace while also staying true to who I am? And as much as I hate to admit it, oftentimes I don't speak out, because if I do, it's at the risk of being told that I'm too sensitive, or that I get offended too easily, or that it's just not worth it. But at what point are people willing to admit that, yes, race issues are controversial, but that's precisely the reason why we need to talk about them? I just turned 18, and there are still so many things that I don't know about the world, but what I do know is that it's hard to admit that you might be part of the problem, that all of us might be part of the problem. So instead of giving you a step-by-step guide on how to not be racist towards Asians, I will let you decide what to take from this talk. All I can do is share my story. My name is Canwin, my favorite color is purple, and I play the piano but not so much the violin. I have 2 incredibly supportive, hardworking parents and one very awesome 10-year-old brother. I love calculus more than anything, despise eating rice, and I'm a horrendous driver. But most of all, I am proud of who I am. A little bit American, a little bit Chinese, and a whole lot of both. Thank you.
All right. Sorry. How do I give it? Okay, here we go. Let me share the other screen. Okay, so just for the recording wise, just to let you know, YouTube will not let me post up this recording. So I'm going to edit that out when I post it up and show you the screen and give you the link. And if you want to watch it again, you can do it that way, but I won't be able to do that for the recording itself. I did want to talk about the Asian American stereotype. I wish we can probably have a little bit more conversation when we meet in person. So like Mary, store things in your heart and then bring it to class during the weekend if we don't get to quite talk about it. So that was before the breakout of COVID and anti-American violence. Now, whether you knew it or not, I can't believe it's been 2 years already. This is the second year anniversary. So on March 17, 2021, you must have heard of the Atlanta shooting, where a spa house was attacked, and the victims were mainly Asian American women. And so my wife led a prayer meeting with the Asian American Christian Collaborative the day after of the anniversary, and they were able to pray together, lament, and voice an ongoing discussion about what this means. Now, what I'm going to say right now doesn't represent all Asian Americans, but this is my take on it. I think what happened is absolutely horrible, and there's a 2-point engagement. One, I think Asian Americans have to speak out against the violence that are done to our community members, and this should be a uniting force, not a dividing force. And two, it should waken the sleeping giant of Asian Americans that the model minority myth is a lie, that no matter how much we seek to conform, we always be considered other. And there's no point in trying to excel and achieve the model minority myth, because in the end, it's going to be unreachable. And I want to talk about the issue of, and what I think would be helpful is soon after COVID, and by the way, what I want to say is that, especially sensitive to the whole class, regardless of your ethnicity, what I would like to say is that what we're trying to do in this class is name, not blame. I really want to be careful about that. So sometimes when we name things, people feel blamed for it. That's not what's going on. So I want everyone to know that in this class, we're naming, not blaming. But when we name, we also want to engage. And if there are institutions or even individuals that need to be challenged and prophetically challenged by the church, because we're trying to be as faithful to the gospel as we can be, then that's part 2 of a conversation. But I'm now naming, not blaming. But John Cho, I have a story about this. John Cho used to be, when he was a college student at UC Berkeley, he was in my small group when I was teaching, when I was leading the discipleship groups as a campus minister. But that's another story. I know that I know he chose the way of Hollywood. I felt like that might have been the best choice for him spiritually, but nevertheless, that's another story. But John Cho, he's a famous actor. You might have seen him especially in the Star Trek movies with Christopher Pine and some other people. But he had this open letter to the LA Times when COVID broke out, and his reflections on how that exposed a lie of the model minority myth in light of the Asian American violence, because basically people were angry at the death, the pain, the suffering, the lack of freedom people were experiencing in this nation because of COVID. They targeted Chinese Americans as if they were a direct cause for their current suffering under the COVID pandemic. And it was ugly. So especially in Los Angeles and New York, they had the highest distribution nationally of violent crimes in urban areas against ethnic Asian Americans, specifically Chinese Americans. It divided across racial lines in this sense. And here's where I'm naming, not blaming. The violence against Asian Americans wasn't just white. And this is a problem of the media too. But especially when the one who did the violence was Black, that got far more television coverage than white perpetrators. If you look at the statistics, it's not an exceptionally quote unquote Black problem. It's a problem for all ethnic groups in their violence. They're all been named. It's not just, but then if you notice the media coverage, I often notice that I'm really sensitive about color. And I notice that disproportionately African-American violence against Asian Americans on this issue is exceptionally well televised and spotlighted. That's problematic. But you also have Asian Americans too. So my mom, when COVID broke out, and there's thousand things wrong about this. I'm just saying that there's 1,000 things wrong about this. But let me just explain the fear. I am of Korean descent, not Chinese. And my mom experienced a few number of just random strangers, and they were white, that just lashed out on her and blaming her for all the conditions of COVID. So what she started to do was wear this shirt where there was this big heart that says, I love America. On one half of the heart is a Korean flag. On the other half of the heart is an American flag. Do you see what's happening here? She wanted the people to know that she's not Chinese and she's not to blame for the COVID virus. She's Korean American. She sent a copy of this spot couple shirts for her daughter-in-laws, including my wife. And I know the heart behind it. She cares for her daughter-in-laws. She loves them. And I know I can name, and I know that all of us can name 1,000 things that are wrong about this. But what I want you to hear is the fear. The fear is real. And my mom's 85 years old. And you have a 20-year-old, 30-year-old something screaming at you while you're trying to eat lunch in a restaurant. You don't go and eat out anymore. You get things delivered. You're really careful. You're afraid, even so. I just want to name this. So not blaming, but the anti-Asian violence is racism often works this way. It just doesn't divide between whites and other people of color, between people of color, even people that are in a broad umbrella called Asian American. And within that, there are different ethnic descents, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, there's Southeast Asians like Vietnamese, Pacific Islanders, like Filipino, Southern Asians like Indian, Pakistani. There's divides even between this. That's what racism does, divides. So here's John Crow's comment. And so growing up, my parents encouraged me and my younger brother to watch as much television as possible so that we might learn to speak and act like natives. The hope was that race would not be disadvantaged, hate would not be a disadvantage to us, the next generation, if we played our cards right. Like fame, the model minority myth can provide an illusion of racelessness. Putting select Asians on pedestal silences those who question systemic justice. Our supposed success is used as proof that the system works. And if it doesn't work for you, it must be your fault. Did you hear that? So this is how the model minority myth is used, especially against groups of non-Asian descent. Never mind that 12% of us are living below the poverty line, meaning Asian Americans. The model minority myth helps maintain a status quo that works against all peoples of color. Perhaps the most insidious effect of this myth is that it silences us. It seduces Asian Americans and recruits us to act on its behalf. It converts our parents, who in turn encourage us to accept it. It makes you feel protected that you're passing as one of the quote unquote good ones. If the coronavirus has taught us anything, it's that the solution to a widespread problem cannot be patchwork. Nevertheless, has our interconnectedness and our reliance on each other been plainer? You can't stand up for some and not for others. And like the virus, unchecked aggression has the potential to spread widely. If you see it on the street, say something. If you hear it at work, say something. If you sense it in your family, say something. Stand up for your fellow Americans. And I'm going to say that, and I'm going to tie it together. I want to give an intercultural readings of scripture where we went, because of tech difficulties, we're going over time, but let me just wrap this up. In Revelation 7, never mix the context. When the seer of John sees this grand vision of the entire people of God from every nation, all tribes, all peoples, all languages before the throne and the slain lamb, who are the ones who are worshiping? And so in verse 13, chapter 7, it says, then one of the elders addressed me, who are these, robed in white, where they come from? And I said to him, sir, you are the one that knows. Then he said to me, these are they who have come out of the great suffering or ordeal or tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So what unites the people of God is the fact that we suffer for the gospel. We live authentically live for what we believe God wants us to live. And we live in a broken and fallen world where if we try to live for Christ, it will try to pulverize us to do something else. And yet that is what connects us. And so if I were to speak to fellow Asian Americans, I would not buy into the the great lie of the model minority myth, I would say, where is our interconnectedness with the people of God? It's through our suffering. It's through speaking out against systemic injustice and getting pulverized for it. It's about and learning what it means to not return evil with evil, but to overcome evil with good. What does that look like? How do we do this, not individually, but together? Individually, that's really hard, but there's power to when God's people who are united to overcome evil, not with more evil, but with good. And so what anti-Asian American violence can do is it can awaken us to our real history. You read it in Takagi's book, that there is a history of suffering living in this country that unites us with other people, ethnic people groups. And that is a source of unity. And if we engage the model minority myth, if I was speaking to fellow Asian Americans, and for those who believe in and say that and perpetuate it or blame Asian Americans for it, if we do that, then we enter into a narrative and identifying forming story that divides us with one another. And so my charge would be to the Asian American community, if I was reading this interculturally, is to embrace the call of Revelation 7, to be among those who are dressed in white, to know what it means to suffer and yet to be blameless before God in our conduct, in our speech, in our witness to the world. And if we do that, then here's a little quote from Reverend Esau McCaulley. You might have known him for his book, Reading While Black. He wrote this little editorial in the New York Times, and I want you to see the connections. So one of the things I want you to do in this class is, as you hear these different histories, don't these histories connect? It's not exactly the same, but I want us to think analogically, that certain historical events find analogs in other ethnic histories, and those are points of solidarity. We got a little bit of a glimpse when we heard about how Asian American farmers and Mexican migrant workers united for rights in agriculture and in the work that they do in the fields. The rights of non-land owning migrant workers was a point of unity between Asian Americans and Mexican Americans. What's the point of unity across not just ethnicities, but across all people from every tribe and nation? It has to be the suffering experience because of our fidelity to the gospel. If we are, it doesn't matter what ethnicity we're in, I think we've experienced when we've been faithful to the gospel, the world is pushed back hard. That's our point of unity. So Reverend McCaulley says that my work as a minister of the gospel is not to fix America, but to remind it of what is not. It's not the kingdom of God, our great hope. It's not. That's not America. Indeed, far too often, God has looked upon us and our notions of justice and found America wanting. Alongside the litany of suffering that marks the Black experience, there is a chant that grows in the power in the times of crisis. It is in the spirituals and the blues, in the hip hop and soul and gospel music. It is in the Black poetry, fiction, and film. It is, of course, a defiant joy, a refusal to let fear stifle hope. I think that's a common testimony, that there is a defiant joy that all God's people experience. Joy because of Christ, defiance against a broken and fallen world that ceases to enslave and colonize. And this should be a basis of unity among God's people. It's the vision of Revelation 7. It's the grand narrative that John Apocalypse the Seer has in mind. And it's something that I hope that might characterize some of our thought, life, and discussion as we go through. I am so sorry, but we need to go on. So I'm gonna stop sharing. I wish I could discuss this a little bit more. Maybe, okay, how about this? So just like any quick responses or comments, if you keep it short, I'll give Denise and Michael a chance to set up. You're gonna be on next. None? Okay, then we won't. Absorb it. Like Mary, store it in your heart. Bring what you store the class when we meet together on the weekend, but we need to move on. So please, Michael and Dee, why don't you lead us through Mexican American history? At least we have time for your presentation. We'll follow up next week.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and Denise is going to begin.
Thank you, Michael. I'm having technical difficulties too. Thanks for sharing your screen. This was a really good book in terms of so much not known about Mexican history and the backstory. So this is our presentation, Michael and I, and it's the 10 historical events, Los Mexicanos, Formation of a People. Next, Michael. So this is the introduction. Lo Mexicano, Formation of a People, integrates the history of nations, anthropological developments of religious thought, trade, industry, race, and power over the course of 1,000 years. Native tribes, Españoles, Mestizos, Criollos, and later Norteamericanos have shared history revealed in Gonzalez's historical collection of the human spirit and its pursuit for identity. The reader is challenged to rally for progress or sedentary. The formation de los Mexicanos is current, historically overwhelmed by economic, political, and social unrest. Mexicanos remain determined to convey and secure a geopolitical presence in today's modern world. So here we have the backstory to the formation of Mexico. Of course, we know of the Spanish, that colonial power that settled in Mexico. So these are just some of the details surrounding that. So this is an overview of Spain, which is known as the Iberian Peninsula, which is now Spain and Portugal. Once a region occupied by the Moors, an Islamic group from Northern Africa for 750 years. The Moors are the green area here. On the map, the Moorish scholars are credited in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century for their contributions in the arts, literature, mathematics, and philosophy. Ironically, within this Moors region, there was a small enclave of Jewish settlements, which produced one of the most famous Jewish philosophers, Maimonides, and also the Muslims were identified as the Caliphate. So they established academies in Barcelona, Cordoba, Granada, and Toledo. So some of the pre-colonial presence of the Americas, one of the holy wars and religious events that kind of expedited this whole process of exploration was the Crusades. Pope Urban II of Rome, the Western Church, at the Council of Cremant, which is in 1095, initiated the call for a holy war to recapture the holy city of Jerusalem that was invaded by the Turks in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which is Greece, Turkey, and the Middle East. The Reconquista Spanish Crusades, which focused mainly on pushing the Moors north to North Africa, was led by King Alfonso VIII of Castilla. And the Moors at this point were defeated. They were pushed to Northern Africa. After the defeat, Spain began to develop a form of Christian nationalism that would later contribute to the narrative of the New World. And part of their crusade was funded by Pope Innocent III. Some of the early expeditions that began to take place after the Moors were conquered, we have a famous navigator, which is Prince Henry the Navigator, who was Portuguese. He explored and traveled along the African coast and later discovered routes to the Indian Ocean. But the Portuguese are credited to initiating the African slave trade. One of the identifiers of Spain is that they were a maritime culture, which emerged due to its locality and unhindered access to the Atlantic coast. And of course, from this maritime presence, we have Cristoforo, which is Christopher Columbus. We've all heard of him, who sailed to the New World, the Americas, an expedition that was funded by Isabella and Ferdinand, King and Queen of Spain. So what begins to happen here in the New Spain? First, Christopher Columbus, he leaves Spain in his fleet, the Niña de Pinta Santa Maria. He departs from Palos de la Frontera, a port in search of spices in India, but discovered the New World, which is Hispaniola, which we know as Santo Domingo in Cuba today. However, in 1519, Herman Cortez, among explorers of the early expeditions of Cuba, was the one who later discovered southern Mexico, the Southern Territory. And this is not a Spanish word, this is a native word here. So I've been trying to pronounce it correctly, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. So that's where Cortez landed. And he began to have tensions with the Aztec culture. The Aztecs were characterized as master builders and valiant warriors. Gonzalez writes, when Spaniards entered their expanding empire of the Aztecs in 1519, they encountered a militaristic and theocratic kingdom. The chief of the Aztecs was Moctezuma, who was a formidable foe against the Spanish conquest. He had several skirmishes there were several skirmishes that occurred between the Aztecs and the Cortes regiment or cavalry. After a tragic defeat, the Cortes cavalry sought an alliance with friendly native, the Tlaxcala, who despised the Aztecs for their inhumane actions toward neighboring native communities. They were also cannibalists and they conducted human sacrifice for ceremonial rituals. On August 13, 1521, the Aztecs experienced a major defeat by the Spanish settlers that resulted in a new stronghold for the Spanish monarch, which then began New Spain, which is now Mexico. So this map here I'm a visual learner, so in order for me to really understand how each of these groups were moving, so in the yellow area, you see Hernan Cortez. He would have traveled along the Gulf of Mexico to enter into that area of the Aztecs. And then if you go further north up, it shows you the arrival of the Aztecs in that central area of Mexico in 1300s, and all of the other native people that were in that area as well. Next slide. So La Frontera of Mexico. Now you have Mexico developing as a nation. So once you visualize the settlers in the Aztec Empire, that middle region, now there was a desire to move further north up the Mexico. So the myth of golden cities led to the exploration north of the Aztec Empire. And that north area is called Baja California. So you see that there on the map. In 1540, led by Vasquez de Coronado, an expedition of men and women and children discovered areas known as present-day New Mexico, Oregon, Baja California, which is Lower California. That's what Baja means. 1519, they began to have permanent settlements there. Juan de Onote established key traveling routes from Mexico City to Santa Fe. The route named the Camino Real de Tierra, the Royal Road of the Interior. In 1598, the Acoma battle, years after Coronado's expedition, Onote's men attempted to revive relations with dwellers from the western New Mexico region. And the attempt resulted in the Acoma battle, where both parties experienced violent sieges, and Onete was able to capture the city, which is New Mexico. One of the most important influences of these expeditions were religious, right? So the whole idea of the Crusades transferred over into exploration into the New Spain or Mexico. This idea of making sure that Christianity prevailed beyond Mexico. So the missionaries were part of the conquest strategy to expand Spanish territory with continuous conversion of natives to practice Catholicism. The key religious sects were Franciscans, Jesuits, and Dominicans. The Franciscans, they traveled with Juan de Onate into New Mexico, which was an apostolic mission. The missions also stretched along the Rio Grande from El Paso del Norte, present day Ciudad de Juarez. Father of Arizona, Eusebio led missionary expeditions to present day Arizona. 1697, Father Juan Maria de Salvatere, a Jesuit, led mission efforts in Baja California, originally founded in 1533 by Hernan Cortez. The Franciscans, they led the charge to establish missionaries now in what we call High California, Alta California. In 1823, after the Spanish rule, San Francisco was built. So here we have a real formation of the people as a result of the colonization of Mexico. These are some of the successes and also the demographics that spurred out of this conquest. So in 1821, Mexico gains independence from Spain, a charge that was led by Creole Spanish-born citizens who were discontent with the monarch abuse. Part of the successes that became prevalent was this ranchero, right? The ranchers, aristocracy that thrived in California, securing power for their class. The mestizos, who I'll explain who they are in the demographics, were some sort of a middle class within this new Spain. Pueblo towns along the Rio Grande ran from Colorado, the Gulf, to the Gulf of Mexico, offering communal and economic stability. Then you had the missionary strongholds that were led by the Franciscans, the Jesuits' orders, and established political strongholds in New Mexico and Central Mexico. So the demographics that emerged from this conquest is now Spain, the new Spain, which becomes Mexico. It's racially integrated. So you have what we call the mestizos, who were the merger of an Indian and Spaniard residents. The pobladores, who were just Spanish settlers with no mixed race. The Pueblo Indians, who lived apart from the Spanish settlers. Some of them mixed, many of them not. You had the indigenous population, who were also nomadic tribes who never mixed with the Spaniards. Then as we move on, you start to see the Norteamericanos, who established themselves in what is called Texas. The nomadic tribes, which with the Apaches, who remained in continuous battles with both the Mexican people and the North Americans. The Creoles, who were the Spanish ancestry that were born in the Americas. So now what begins to happen in Mexico. So here you have the Spanish Empire that's building, but then east is the American colonies in 1776, who had just established their independence from America. So now they were beginning to travel west. And now here we have the clash that takes place within what we call the Texas Anglos and the Mexicans. In 1836, there was a Texas revolt that occurred. The Mexican president, Santa Anna, his attempt to stop the annexation, attacked Texans rebels at the Alamo. One of the most famous Texans rebels that we know is Davy Crockett, who fought for Texas independence, but he lost his life during this particular battle. The leader of the Texan rebels was a man named Sam Houston, and here he led to the victory of the annexation and independence of Texas from Mexican rule. Immediately after, Texas, which is now called the Lone Star, and that's where it gets its name, the Lone Star Republic, petitioned the American Congress for admission to the American Republic. The permission was denied. In 1845, Texas is ratified as a state of the United States. So from 1836 to 1845, Texas was really a lone star. They were independent. They were no longer a part of the Mexico regime, and they were not a part of Texas. So they were fighting off Mexican threats by themselves. Then in 1848, Americans, the Manifest Destiny campaign began, which initiated the Mexican-American War. So the Manifest Destiny were the American colonists now who were a state, who believed that that moving west was a God-given right to expand Protestantism and Christianity. In 1848, they fought against the Mexicans, and they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war. And America gains all of the territories that you saw in the previous maps, which was Baja California and all the claims to Texas. So under the Treaty of Guadalupe, the United States acquired 45,000 Native Americans in the state of New Mexico. In 1854, the Americans begin to pursue more territory. So we have the Gadsden Purchase, an agreement where Mexico sold the remainder lands, which is Arizona, New Mexico, to the United States. And here we have the emergence of the Southern Transcontinental Rails that followed. So in 1881, the Southern Pacific arrived in El Paso, Texas on May 19th, 1881, linking with the Pacific Railroad and linking the western part of Texas to its southern region. Southern expansion, unfortunately, stirred up racial tensions. On page 98 in the book, and I didn't want to miss this, there was a woman who she stated it was a self-defense where one of the settlers in California entered into her cabin and were trying to either hurt her or, any type of sexual assault. And she defended herself and killed this Anglo miner, which then led to her lynching. She was the first woman in California that was lynched, and she was of Mexican descent. So the railroad industry accounted for 70% of US investments in Mexico. This led to massive disruption of rural life for Mexicans who were farmers, and also the high tariffs on Mexican crops, resulting later on to the Great Migration North for jobs. And this is the geography explained here with the Texas Revolution. You see the Alamo, and then I wanted to also put in a map of the Rio Grande, so where settlers were able to build homes along that river. And the presidio, that word there, Persidio, is actually Spanish forts. And Michael?
Okay, thank you, Denise, for all your work on
Thank
that. So a little bit of a jump from the early 1900s. I didn't quite capture that, but with the Great Depression that initiated one of the major turning points in the Mexicano population in the United States. So financial collapse magnified and amplified existing racial tension in the United States. And they weren't naming, they were blaming. And so Mexicanos became a popular scapegoat, with numerous media sources publishing items on the Mexican problem. Job competition, hiring bias, and assistance programs accelerated a permanent relocation of the Mexicano population from the countryside to urban centers. So the Great Depression, this is the movement of people moved toward urbanization at this point. And scholars estimate that 1/3 to 1/2 of the Mexicano population repatriated to Mexico between 1929 to 1935. And perhaps half of those that repatriated was done against their will. And the author noted that, I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, I didn't note it in there. So Great Depression began people movement, and then World War II gave a new opportunity. So that would be the next big event. World War II created so that the children of immigrants were motivated to have an avenue of winning acceptance in American society. So high numbers of these immigrant children enlisted to serve in World War II. One of the items in the book is that their contributions are largely unrecognized as the history of the war is told. They're not celebrated by those outside the community, but very well documented from within. The GI Bill provided an economic upward mobility opportunity for those that had served. And perhaps what began new immigration and movement north was Europe was pretty destroyed, and the United States filled a global food production and distribution void. So this created a lot of jobs and farming opportunities. And one specific program that was started was a guest worker program called the Bracero program. Excuse me for my pronunciation. And so that period from World War II continued to 1965. A little bit more of post-World War II. There were frequent attempts at mobilizing, organizing, and trying to humanize the workers and communities. And so going back to Manifest Destiny and just the formation of dehumanization of everyone except Europeans, there was frequent attempts at mobilizing, not often successful up to this point. An immigrant community held a thoroughly negative attitude toward politics. So those that came from Mexico really were formed by the corruption there, and they had no interest in American politics. So the next formative event is the Chicano movement, 1965 to 1975. And in Gonzalez, he defines that a Chicano is a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself. So there was this movement began from dissatisfaction from the lagging socioeconomic gains. Their communities were just not moving in any sort of pace with the communities around them. The population centered in the Southwest, so I think it was 87% of the population was in California and Texas. And then the most influential person noted was Cesar Chavez, and I don't know, Dolores Fernandez Huerta became the most prominent unifying voices in Mexicano history. And so Cesar Chavez is attributed with most of that work, but the book highlighted how important Dolores Huerta was as well. There's a strict commitment to militant nonviolent mobilization, in that what they created was called the United Farm Workers. And I believe Professor Lee it was more than just within their own Mexicano people groups. They were advocating for farmers. And so, and they're, yeah. So from after the Chicano movements, the Chicana and Chicano student movements also emerged in that time period. And so student movements began on campuses, mostly in California, resistance to power, cultural revitalization, and activism. The Chicano movement grew out of discerning an added layer of discrimination. So the third layer is gender. And the Chicano movement was noted to have opposition from within and outside the community. And overall, some of the historians, the Chicano movement observers lament the unrealized potential of the movement. So moving into the mid-70s through the early 90s, the demographic accelerates. The number of immigrants from Mexico steeply accelerated in the 1980s, and there was a high birth rate. So at this point, 90.5% of the Mexicano population is now in urban centers. So the response in the author calls it nativist response is restrictionist campaigns on immigration. So continuance of legislative action similar to Asian Americans and any people group, it seems like, other than Europeans. There's 1986 was IRCA, in 1990 the Immigration and Nationality Act, and then perhaps the biggest one to note is NAFTA in 1994. And so we'll talk a little bit more about NAFTA on the next slide. So looming potential electorate power. They could see there are numbers and power coming, but it mostly goes unrealized up to this point. So the Hispanic challenge, massive immigration rivaling the Great Migration 100 years prior. And September 11th, at the same time, so we have massive immigration, then September 11th happens, increase of xenophobia and the advent of the Homeland Security Department. And it conflates immigration with issues of terrorism, drugs, and threats to national security. So all of a sudden, immigration is connected to these other terrorist issues, and fear is prevalent everywhere. And so NAFTA was intended to slow migration by helping Mexico. They were supposed to benefit from NAFTA, but really what happened was the wealthy in both countries consolidated more wealth, and it didn't really have much of an effect at slowing down anything. And in 2004 to 2008, the Hispanic hate crimes rose 25%. And within this whole period of time, the GOP rose to power, gained power, and it became this home of nativist messaging and mobilization. And their new base joined the southern states that were historically Democratic, but the nativist voice, they adopted the GOP as their base. And so consequentially, the Mexicano electoral base is starting to awaken as legislation continues to happen. There's a ban on bilingual education in California, outlawing affirmative action, and their grassroots voter base started to show up pretty well, even though those measures did pass. And then lastly, our last portion is Homeland Security State. That's our current movement. Fear permeates the messaging against undocumented immigrants. There's some slowing of immigration when the economic crisis hit, the housing crash, 2000, 2009. And from September 11th, the Patriot Act has really militarized the police force, and they made entering the country without documentation a crime. And so then the police are now involved in this, as well as the federal agencies, ICE. So the Obama presidency saw political advancement on some level. There was numerous appointments, I think 48 appointments that were significant. And the immigration policy did not really change, though. And then there's been a fight over DACA, as it gave a pathway for citizenship, but it's been very much maligned and fought against. So that's what we have for our presentation.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Very well done. A lot to absorb. You packed a lot in. I want to be conscious of the time. We're going to continue recording. I want to spend 10 minutes at most before, and we won't be able to finish. We'll have to go on next. We'll have to continue next week. But if you need to leave, go ahead and do. So just listen to the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes of the class. Let me go ahead and share the screen. So as a follow-up, what I want to do is I want us to have some questions to consider in light of the presentation. So let me what happened? Let me share a screen first. I think that'll be easier. And I'll share this. Okay, and let me do full screen. Okay, so some questions I want people to consider. We can start a conversation. We're not going to finish. Is what does it mean to be Mexican American? I mean, thank you for Denise, for that very detailed prehistory. I think it's important that Mexican Americans are considered, eventually the term mestizos isn't just a subgroup within that prehistory, but it refers to the whole of the Mexican American identity experience, that it is a mixture of European Spanish colonizers and Meridians intermarrying over, but it's over a period of 500 years. From the conquest of Cortez until the New Spain settlements in California, Texas, and Southwest. So Mexican identity and memory, what does it mean to be Mexican American? I think we had to ask about the significance of the Mexican American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe. The idea of manifest destiny endures, and it's problematic. It is a vestige from the Crusades, as Denise noted the connection. That was very well done. But the idea that somehow the United States is a chosen nation as a particular instrument of God's will, more than other nations of the world, is really problematic, because that is a reference to God's people. In the Old Testament, to Israel. In the New Testament, it is another type of mestizos, a mixture of different, it's not limited to one country or nation or ethnic allegiance. This is a form of Christian nationalism, manifest destiny, indicative to the North American context, spreading around the world. And it has had devastating effects where we do acts of injustice that colonize politically or economically other nations, and then we think it's God's will. So that's the sinister side of it. So what is the significance of Mexican American War and Treaty of Guadalupe? I think it's the beginning of the manifest destiny that has an enduring narrative today. What's the relationship between Mexican American labor laws and the history of immigration and forced migration across the Southwest border? To put it shortly, something to consider is that the border is open. That means we want Mexican migrant workers to come into the States when there's a need for it. So so farming and service industries want migrant workers when the economy is good. When there's economic depression, recession, undocumented Mexican American men are scapegoated as taking jobs below minimum wage from other US citizens. That has always been the fluid dynamic. So it's quite exploitive that we only want Mexican American immigrants when they provide a chief source of labor and the economy is running well. So we need that labor force. When the economy is going badly and Americans are out of work, there's the job rates going up. That's when undocumented Mexican American workers are scapegoated and blamed for taking jobs below minimum wage from US citizens. That's that history traces to the Great Migration, the Great Depression. I don't want to call it the origin, but that is the most prominent part of past history. And this has not stopped for the past couple hundred years. It's been the same since then. And rightly so, Denise and Mike have noted that conditions have changed a little bit, and it's some good, some bad for Mexican Americans since World War II. The GI Act, what it does, what introduces the idea that educational opportunities given Mexican Americans mitigate, not eliminate, mitigate some of the tension between the long history of labor exploitation and immigration, and the ability to become naturalized citizens. So, and that there's all this shift. September 11th made it more difficult for immigration. It basically militarized the police in forced exportation of non-documented immigrants. We had the DREAM Act, which is really promising, but then we have a new change of presidency, something the book doesn't cover because of when it was published, but the Trump wall, for lack of a better word, changed the politics of this nation again. We are on the verge of another economic recession, and when that happens, we should expect rhetoric against immigration to reach new unjust heights in this country. That's the pattern. That I think the church should be aware of the patterns. You know, we're quite open to immigration when the economy is good. When the economy is considered to be bad, the borders tighten. It's a very exploitive relationship. So So those are some of the things that I want to talk about. And we can, but so on the output, I'll post up the slides. I want us to be ready to discuss these things. And also be able to bring your questions in. But the issue of the Mexican-American experience has always been, well, ironically, what is that Mexican-Americans have a longer history if their ancestry traces back to intermarrying between Meridians and Spanish settlers. And yet we treat them as if they're the latter group that is kind of invading in a North American context. The Mexican-American War was travesty. We forcibly annexed the Southwest states. They belonged to Mexico. We stole them at the United States, effectively militarily colonized that area. You can call it steal, whatever you want to call it, military colonized, but from that point on, they never went back to Mexico. So what do we do about these issues of systemic injustice and then we treat that Mexican Americans as being the foreigner who's trying to invade in through the southwest border parts of the United States. So these are just a lot of complex issues. Let me stop here. And let me return it to Dee and Mike, and then we'll close out. Any final comments? Like what struck you about the history? What do you want to kind of name as you think being very important that the church should be aware of?
I think one of the things that I was discussing with Michael this morning is that the Mexican community has never recovered, as you mentioned, from the Mexican-American War. There's still remnants of the economic, social, religious disparities that are still lingering now in the 20th. That just, it amazed me and gave me a new heart as a minister of faith. You know, my family, we identify, I was telling Michael, as Puerto Rican, but we're not privy to Mexican history. So there's even biases within, Caribbean nations who share the same language, Spanish language, against people at the border. And that's something that's not usually discussed openly, right? But to know how this country still has not recovered, I'm amazed. I wasn't familiar with the in-depth history. Juanita being the first woman lynched in California, and really, there was a comment in the book that Mexican are still kind of our native people that are traveling from back and forth from border to border and are not receiving the credit, as you mentioned, Professor Max, as having ancestry that predates. So it's a lot of learning I think for Americans to change their mindset on how they view people from Mexico and from South America, right? Because it's not just Mexico that's hurting. And I can see now why you were able to witness the rise of the cartels within those regions. The economic climate birthed them. So it is complex history.
Thank you. Michael, you want to make some final comments before we close out?
It was a very dense book as far as a lot of detail, and I appreciated that. There's a lot I don't know, and I think the aha for me even came on today in the discussion was the question over who I think the humanization of one another and the dehumanization of, again, it's played through just connecting that dot of how the places where the Mexicano populations concentrated were places they used to own. But even then it was still it's a mixing of colonization, and it's still complex. but it is very interesting how there's so much indignant attitude toward
Hmm.
movement back to
Hmm.
places where they historically have lived. And so
Hmm.
anyway,
Hmm.
that's very fascinating.
Thank you. I mean, I'm sorry. I really want actually to hear Rodney and Fred and also Adham, and then I know Chrissy had to go, but we're close on time. So what I would like for us to do is I'm gonna post up the slides. Just think through some of the questions that I just kind of scanned over at the end, and bring your own comments. What did you notice about? So this is for Christy too, since I know you're going to listen to the recording. What did you notice of Mexican history? What do you think the church needs to hear? Your communities. I can think of my communities, but then also the church as a whole. So I think what I would tell my community is that Asians, our immigration experience is different, but we went through Angel Island. We know what it means that to be in this country and not have the right to be naturalized because of our skin color. And I think African Americans' history has that added complex, tragic layer that people were invited as a labor force. It was a slave labor. That makes it a completely different dynamic. Nevertheless, these stories have ways where our communities can, for lack of a better word, see ourselves in each other's story a little bit more than we did before, with that empathy and with that, I hope, also advocacy, that we want to advocate and we want to bear witness to one another and against any injustice that we experience. So please think about the questions, think about what struck you, be able to share what you notice about the histories. And maybe we can ask, so for the communities that we swim in, what messages you want to share from this history? And what does the whole church as a whole need to do and learn? So we'll stop here. Thank you, everyone. So we're kind of at this 25% lag time. We're gonna finish this next class session, begin the session, and then whatever is unfinished in our third Zoom session, we do it in person.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And
I
Denise
won't
and
be able to-
Michael, thank you.
I won't be able to be on the call next week, so I'll
Okay,
watch the.
Oh.
yeah, please watch the video. Yes, Michael, you told me about that. I understand that. So thank you. Okay, bye everyone. Blessings.
Bye,
to you.
everyone.
Did you need Rodney and I to stay back? You mentioned that last.
Oh yeah. Okay, just very quickly. So why don't you stick around? Thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
and Rodney, I think, did you get word that you could stay at that apartment on campus together?
I got something. I have to go back and revisit it, but I did.
Okay.
I did get that email. Yes.
You and I will be sharing that. So
Oh, that's great. You can share fellowship and also share the cost. So that's
yeah,
great.
I look forward to that.
Okay.
All right. All right. Thanks,
And
brother.
whoever else needs it, that makes
Yeah.
sense. So
All right.
Thanks. Great. My charge to you is it's very, very short. So notice that the group they're trying to do big, like it's hard to specify 10 specific events, although sometimes the history warrants it. So I think the history of Japanese internment, it deserves its own event. But generally you have these macro categories like under the 10, like history of immigration, and then a lot of sub events, or history of Mexican, North American, or United States conflict, and the history of and how that birthed the manifest destiny narrative or lie. I mean, really, it's lie. So, and under that, there's all these little sub events, labor history, and all these sub events. Chicana movement is big. So that's what what's interesting is that where education can be a resource for communities to prophetically challenge injustice, the Chicana movement and the Asian American Studies movement, that they find alignment. I think, and the first ethnic studies department at any university was Black history and Black American studies. So this was actually something that we share. So you have these big macro movements. So to your best ability, I know it's hard. We never feel we do justice to history when we try to reduce into 10 categories, but the 10 categories don't feel like you have to, one, be the expert. 2, that you can't change your mind. What you're doing is suggesting, given this complex history, these are 10 ways to categorize or organize, a history that pushes against categorization. But nevertheless, we're trying to help the class wrap their head around it. So
Yes.
I think a good way to think about it is this: everyone's going to do the reading. I don't doubt that. People are doing the reading, but pretend as if they didn't do the reading. So if you were to present this to someone who's unfamiliar with what you've read, explain it from scratch. So I think that's the easiest way to organize a PowerPoint slide, is not to assume what people remember from the sign. So pretend as if they didn't do it, although we will have done it, and present in that way. You aim for 15 minutes. If you hit 20, that's okay. I kind of raise the flag a little bit, saying that if you're going over 20 minutes, you need to kind of wrap it up soon. And don't feel like you have to give the prescriptive, definitive, knock down, drop the mic account. Really, you're giving us something that we can talk about and engage. And this is our reference point when we think about, well, how do we interpret the Bible? And how do these communities interpret the Bible? That's what we're going to do when we meet in person. So that's it. So just want to I'm hoping that alleviates some of the pressure. You don't have to give a definitive account. And then also the approach. Pretend no one's read it, although they have, and present that way.
Just so I'm clear, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
The statements you're making almost sound
Yeah.
in tension with each other. From the one vibe I'm getting, macro, don't be too detailed, but then treat the book as if people haven't read. So like in one of my other classes, advanced seminar, we're giving a book review. This is not a book review, right? This
no.
Yeah. This is an
So-
overall. Yeah.
So you're trying to give us a sense of the book is a resource for a 10-minute history, and some of the students have. And this is where I say in the syllabus, some classes say, don't use Google or internet sources, but I say, the training wheels are off. Just go ahead and do it. So if you need to draw other sources in, do quick Google searches, use whatever resources. I mean, I always assess, make sure that the source is, reliable, to a reasonable degree. But nevertheless, if you're finding trouble just distilling how to organize all this from the book itself, then draw in other resources too. So, and then just as our presenters did, just give us a little short bibliography. Let me know where you're getting some of these ideas from, if it's not completely from the book.
Got it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you want to give detail, but I think what I'm trying to avoid is that, what if the presenter said, okay, so Hidalgo Treaty, that's one event. And then the Great Depression, that's another event. And then DACA, the Dream Act, that's another event. I mean, those are important, but they wouldn't encapsulate, it's the example of something larger. So just
got it.
Okay.
Makes sense. Rodney, we'll talk tomorrow.
Oh yeah, and you have this room. So this room never closes. If you want to meet on Zoom, not worry. And then this is an account that doesn't close after 45 minutes or anything like that. So if you want to arrange with each other, hey, let's meet online, and you just use the link to this room. It's not locked, and the room will automatically assign one of you as the co-host or something like that. And you can use this time. So this room is not used for anything other than this class. So
perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Sounds good. I kind of lost a part of it, but Fred and I will kind of collaborate. I'll get whatever I missed. He'll fill me in.
Okay.
My mom was calling me as you were kind of explaining one thing. I was trying to.
Okay.
No, Mom, I can't talk right now.
Yeah, it's all good.